Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the next chapter in our series of aquaculture-related webinars designed to bring together science and business to expand and strengthen the United States aquaculture industry. These webinars are a joint effort between the National Aquaculture Association, the North Central Regional Aquaculture Center, and the United States Aquaculture Society. Whether you're currently engaged in aquaculture, looking to get into business, or an educator helping others understand aquaculture, or if you just want to become a better educated consumer, we hope that these webinars will enhance your knowledge and move you forward on your journey to success. Today's webinar is a continuation of our discussion on biosecurity. Dr. Roy Yanong is back to help us understand what goes into a good biosecurity plan and how to go about putting one together. Roy is a University of Florida professor and extension veterinarian based out of the Tropical Aquaculture Laboratory in Ruskin, Florida. Roy, we appreciate you taking time with us today to lead us through what many might consider to be a daunting task. I know that many of us think about our biosecurity plans at our facility, but oftentimes we don't follow through and create a written plan that would probably really benefit our employees and students, not to mention the fish we're producing. And for the rest of you with us today, don't forget to join us again next time for an overview of pond management techniques presented by Dr. Jay Shelton with the University of Georgia. That webinar is scheduled for 3 p.m. on August 3rd. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Roy. Take it away.
Thanks very much, and thanks again for everyone for joining today to go into part 2 of biosecurity, what you need to know. Again, thanks everyone for joining today. This is a kind of complicated part 2, which is how to be more specific and actually design and kind of put together your health and biosecurity plan. There's a lot of moving parts to this, and I did have a rough draft template of things that maybe you want to consider putting and including into your biosecurity plan, as I put at the very top of it, and I think hopefully you all received it from Josh Tenney. It is a draft document. It's not really maybe formatted as nicely and as pretty as as we could, but I just wanted to get you something to start looking at, and actually am encouraging you to provide feedback on this. It may have some areas that may not be as relevant for your specific type of aquaculture and species. But also, if you have any additional comments or suggestions, I'm very happy to take it and use your feedback to try to improve it, to maybe come up with a really nice kind of general plan that can be used by everybody, or at least across more industries a little bit more easily. I also wanted to mention that if you do have any questions during this webinar, if you can, feel free to type them into the Q&A section, and we'll go and address those at the very end after the talk. So let's, I guess, get started. Wanted to kind of give a little bit of a recap. We know U.S. aquaculture is really very diverse in species and systems, and this webinar is, as I mentioned, intended to give a general framework for a health and biosecurity plan, and also hopefully will give you a template for a written biosecurity plan. Again, as we've discussed, having something at least in hand and something to start you in the process is better than nothing, and even starting any type of attempt to start looking at your biosecurity, if it's not something you've really concentrated on before, is really a good thing. And don't feel that you have to have everything covered all at once. A lot of this is going to probably be somewhat of a gradual transition into really being a little bit more aware and cognizant of what you need to think about. And if you do have any questions, as I mentioned, you can contact me or type them into the Q&A at the and we can talk about it at the end. So a little bit of a quick recap for the first part of the biosecurity webinar series. What is biosecurity? As we mentioned, these are practices that will minimize the risk of introducing and spreading an infectious disease or disease-causing agents we call pathogens, either into, within, or from your facility. And again, biosecurity really can be thought of as insurance. So it's going to definitely help, hopefully prevent catastrophic losses, but it also hopefully will help for even the low level and moderate losses that will eat into your bottom line. So good biosecurity and a good plan in addition to good husbandry, of course, will really help to kind of take you up to the next level. So we talk about husbandry and good basic husbandry as being pretty much more animal focused, but still pretty important, obviously, but not enough. There's going to be a way for these pathogens to kind of leap over that good husbandry wall if that's all that's there. So you really want to have a focus that includes good husbandry, which is animal focused, and good biosecurity, which is a little bit more pathogen focused, so that hopefully the wall will be high enough to prevent these from getting into your animals. Now, a little bit of a clarification, just so you're aware, and we really didn't talk about this too much because it's a little bit, things get a little more complicated, but just to remind you that a good biosecurity program, if you're starting one now, does not guarantee that your farm is free of specific disease agents or organisms. That's really something that would, and in this example here, I've got this purple monster here, and you may have a purple monster on your farm, but you just maybe don't know about it because the fish is healthy and is a carrier and you haven't been testing for it. So you really need to, if you are worried about specific pathogens and specific disease organisms, you're really going to have to work with a veterinarian and a health specialist and look at statistical sampling, figure out what you need to look at, and actually know what tests that they will know what tests you need to run to determine for your specific lot or facility what diseases may or may not be present. So again, good biosecurity is hopefully keeping things from getting in, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you're free of everything unless you've actually tested your animals. And again, these infectious disease agents or pathogens can be both on the animal and in the animal or in the environment. So you really are looking at trying to manage both as well as their interaction. 3 M's of biosecurity, to remind you, are managing the animals, managing the pathogens, the disease organisms, and managing almost as important, if not more important, the people and the folks that are actually handling the animals and doing all of the work on the facility. They're all, of course, interrelated. Animal management practices are going to include those that will hopefully guarantee or try to help ensure that eggs, fry, juvenile, broodstock, whatever type of life stage, depending on your organisms, are coming in without specific pathogens, or at least as healthy as possible. You want to know your source, know what testing maybe need to be done for specific types of diseases and specific aquaculture livestock, and also consider health evaluations before they come in and after they come in during potentially your quarantine or other procedures. Of course, don't want to push good husbandry aside. You always want to have really good husbandry, reducing stressors, kind of concentrating again on the ability for the animal to stave off any type of diseases. Pathogen management includes practices that are going to exclude them. Pathogen exclusion, prevent hopefully disease agents from coming onto your facility, as well as preventing them from spreading around your facility and leaving the facility. So biocontainment type protocols. We talk a little bit again about really trying to be familiar with what pathogens are of concern for your facility and your type of animals and systems, and that's something you're going to have to work out with hopefully your managers, health management team, veterinarian, health specialists, who folks that you're working with on all of these types of matters. And then the people management, of course, you want to make sure you educate and manage your staff as well as visitors that may be coming on property. Really, really critical. Often the most difficult part of it, to some degree, getting everybody to essentially buy in, have written protocols, accountability, good signs, visitor logs, disinfection stations, depending on what type of system and farm you have, whether it's foot baths, hand washing, net equipment disinfection if you're in a net pen situation, areas to disinfect wetsuits, all these sorts of things need to be put into to place ideally, and vehicle and boat disinfection. A lot of different systems are going to have different specific challenges, and you're not going to be able to rule out pathogens coming in, as we talked about, because of the types of pathogens that are available, and that are around in the environment normally, as well as because of the situations that some of these types of production systems are in, whether they're outdoors in freshwater ponds or even saltwater ponds, or whether they're a potentially coastal or benthic culture, like with a lot of bivalves, or open ocean net pen culture. So those are going to have their own specific challenges with regard to other animal control, other potential ways for things to come in. The source of water is not going to probably be specific pathogen-free. Ability to disinfect is going to be a little complicated. There are going to be a lot of other limitations. A lot of times you're looking at site placement and whether endemic diseases are occurring in those areas with regard to specific types of organisms similar to those you're raising. And you got to do what you can basically, and really try to keep all the principles in mind as you go through. So let's get into the meat of it. We're going to talk about the specific plan, and again, kind of remind you of the things we discussed in the first part of the webinar, but then try to maybe look at what needs to be put down on paper. And again, as I mentioned, the template, hopefully you all received through Josh Tenney's email, is a draft. Admittedly, it's not the cleanest thing, but I really think it might be something that you can at least start looking at. And I do really want any of your feedback. If it's got a lot of issues, just let me know, and we'll try to figure out how to make it as clean as possible so that it is user friendly and down the road. So again, you want to create your health and biosecurity plan first by developing a health team and facility goals. Some of you may have this in place already. Some of you may have smaller facilities. Maybe it's not that easy to do, but you maybe want to at least have one person as a point person, and then have your veterinarian or health specialist, whoever's working with that person, and you start kind of looking at some of these. So don't feel intimidated if you're a small producer or you've got a smaller business than maybe some other producers. You can definitely do some of this stuff. It's just going to be maybe tailored a little bit more to your resources. So in developing a team and your facility goals as well, you want to involve as many people as possible. I've listed a number of folks that could be involved with it. The inner circle is probably going to be a little bit easier to get a hold of, but you want to get as many people, outside agents and consultants, of course, veterinarian, health specialists, diagnostic labs, state and feds, to who you need to report to if there are diseases of concern, for example. And then you also want to have some sort of facility goals. We'll talk a little bit more about it. After that's done, you're going to be working with these folks and performing risk characterization and determining how best to manage those. And essentially that you're going to be going through looking at where your critical control points are. We talked a little bit about that in the first webinar. Where are the areas that things can go wrong, and how can you try to manage those and avoid any real major problems in those areas. Doing this will help also reinforce what type of relevant records you need to keep. Hopefully you are keeping fairly good records husbandry-wise and production-wise, because that's just good business. But you also want to make sure you're keeping records that are going to help you with the health side of it. Good SOPs, standard operating protocols or procedures to address a lot of these issues, and then have really good personnel education, oversight, and accountability. Those are really critical. Again, you want to have stuff written down. It's pretty, easy, and in some cases, it's maybe something that hopefully will become routine enough that people kind of just know, but in the long run, it really does help to have things written down. So there's always a point of reference to go back to, as well as a point of reference in order to potentially change and improve things if you need to. So writing things down, I'm not a great person to want to write things down, but I do when I really need to, and it's really a good thing to have available. And you really want to keep things current. So the plan, the health and biosecurity plan, would be a living document, meaning that if things need to be upgraded or changed, that you can do that. There should be ongoing education as well for all the folks working with you, as well as for yourself if you're an owner or the manager. And you also want to make sure that you are keeping current with communications with all your collaborators. There may be new diseases, emerging diseases that are important to know about. There may be new regulations that you need to be aware of. So you really want to keep everything as current as possible. And this is a little kind of rule of thumb hand that Dr. Kathleen Hartman with USDA kind of really likes, and I included it here in this talk. So if you want to maybe break down 5 of these critical points, and they're going to have kind of maybe subcategories, you can break it down this way using the 5-finger method to remember. You've got the animals, of course, that can bring in some sort of pathogens, especially if they're, new animals coming in, but you could still have some animals on your facility that are carrying diseases you may not be aware of if you haven't been testing, or if they're diseases that may be a little more complicated to try to diagnose. It may come in through the water, may come in through the feed, or live foods, whatever type of nutrition they're getting. It may be coming in through vectors, which are organisms, animals, potentially people that can bring things on their bodies or in their bodies that can be disease-causing organisms. And it could be fomites, which are inanimate objects that can carry things on them, whether it's equipment or vehicles, etc. Things like of those nature. So kind of 5 major categories of how things can be hidden and or brought into your facility or spread through your facility or leave. So an overview of the plan, I've kind of broken it down into these bullet points. Again, there are different ways that this could be organized, and some ways maybe a little bit more user-friendly for you than others, but this is kind of what we're going to go with, just to try to have as much of the information there as possible, and then we can, you can maybe play around with order on your own facility and play around with the template that I provided. So we're going to have general farm information, animal information, a facility map, of course, with flow and perimeter control. Some of these areas are going to be potentially a little bit more tricky for some, and for other facilities, it's going to be really straightforward. So don't feel terrible if you can't do all of these things, but there are things to be aware of. Developing the aquatic health team and who those people are, have facility health goals, considerations about your water and water source, your type of system and environment, potential other organisms, food and feed, people, vehicles, boats, a general overview of animal health and how that is managed, as well as specific pathogens and their diseases that may impact your specific species. So a lot of stuff there. Again, this is something hopefully you're going to slowly digest over the next however long it takes, weeks or months, but it is something I think if you start thinking about it, you'll kind of see things in a new light, and hopefully it'll help you. So general farm information, this is pretty easy. Hopefully you guys can all do this part real fast. So let's come up with a, we're gonna use Tony's tilapia farm as a fictitious kind of farm with the address there, 222 Fish Fry Lane in Ruskin, Florida. Interestingly, pretty close to us, I guess. And some folks, I spoke with some of the USDA folks, and they're talking about using the GPS lat and longitude to kind of help also with demographic, with location. So this is the lat and longitude for Tony's tilapia farm. Farm owner is Tony Smith. His phone number, Eat Tilapia. Pretty clever, right? And email Tony at tonystilapia.com, and I just made up a Florida aquaculture certificate number there. So don't try to look that up. Hopefully it's not someone's real number. All right, then animal information. Again, some folks are really focused on 1 or 2 species or 3. In Florida, it's a little bit more of a challenge. We have some farms that are raising 10, 20, 30, 40 different species of fish. Again, if you're, depending on what you're working with, it is really good to know what is being raised on the facility as well as the purpose. So tilapia and food here, and also what types of life stages are on the facility. Some folks will potentially concentrate on grow out. They're gonna have different issues and biosecurity concerns versus those that are working with broodstock as well as with larvae and fry or other juvenile stages, depending again on species and types of animals you're working with. Ideally, you would also like to have some background on where the life stages sources are. So if your broodstock, for example, for Tony, came from 2 years ago from Big Brother Tilapia Farm, that'd be nice to know. A lot of this is kind of like just for being able to track if there's maybe issues and who can potentially help you with some of this stuff. Hatchery and grow out, like to know, obviously these are coming from your broodstock, or at least from Tony's broodstock, so that's the source there. And then this is another thing that's really pretty helpful. And I showed my template to a couple of colleagues here, and they were saying, well, some folks can't really change their facility flow, and and that's true. But again, I think the point here is that if you have a map and you can kind of figure out how people are moving around, you can see whether or not there's a potential for folks working with juveniles, and then maybe go into broodstock or some other areas, and then coming back, you know, there is a potential that they may spread things. And, you know, it's a really good awareness thing. Not saying, you know, you can or cannot really easily change how things are moving on your facility, but it is really good to know, and maybe there are ways that you can try to reduce the potential for spread. So want to have a good map. Mr. Farmer here has got a map on his little architect table. You know, you can use potentially blueprints for, I know some folks that have, you know, really, you know, maybe high-tech type facilities may have really good blueprints. If you were an outside facility, you can consider using Google Earth, or, you know, we actually had a drone. A friend of mine had a drone and did an aerial shot of our farm here. Of course, photographs from various areas may be helpful. You'd like to know ideally where the animal different life stages are located on the facility. In some facilities, I know these may actually move around depending on the needs and maybe the production cycle. But you know, if there are kind of standard areas, that's really helpful. Moving around in and of itself can potentially be problematic, you know, if disinfection and cleaning is not done. So that's, you know, it is good to know. You may not be able to change that, but you know, if it does move around, if things change, it's nice to indicate that. As I mentioned, traffic flow on the facility. You know, is it logical and in terms of biosecurity? If you have people that are working in multiple life stage areas, are they going into the most biosecure areas first and then working toward the least biosecure areas, you know, which would be preferred? But if that doesn't happen, you know, you're aware of it at least, and you can kind of see, okay, this might be an area that, you know, we need to really make sure that people are using the foot baths, or, you know, cleaning, using separate nets, you know, all these things you really need to maybe pay a little more attention to. Ideally separation by life stage, which you would, you know, indicate on the map. And also if you have a quarantine area, you know, those should be separated. Or if you have animals that are diseased, if there is a way, and hopefully you've built that into your systems, that they can be isolated away from other lots of animals. And then do you have a specific pathway for visitors and or staff? We talked a little bit about already. So these are just some suggestions. As I mentioned, you know, you can use, if you know, Google Earth is fairly current. This is a Google Earth image of our the tropical aquaculture lab here, and you know, you can kind of use that to help. You know, we could use it potentially to help us make a map of the facility if we wanted to overlay something and trace it or whatever. Might have to have different maps for each of the individual buildings we have here, for example, our greenhouses. You know, and then on the right is an unmanned aircraft or a drone shot taken by one of my friends. And again, kind of the same idea. You can sort of use these to help, especially if you've got a big, you know, outdoor facility. This is just Tony's tilapia farm. I kind of made up a sort of facility map here. Got a couple of people working in there already. You know, it's getting toward the end of the day. I'm assuming they're going to go home soon. But I also have a couple of the wells mapped out. So, you know, you'd want to know obviously which of these areas are what. So I've got quarantine Q1 and Q2 there. I've got a quarantine pond. You know, as I mentioned in previous, in the first webinar, maybe you need to have a separate kind of pond because you really don't have buildings, and you sort of want to keep them separate a little bit. It's not perfect and ideal, but it's at least, you know, one way to try to do it. Then we've got broodstock B1 and B2 buildings. We've got a hatchery H1 and H2, and then we have our grow out ponds here, labeled grow out or GO 1 through 12. We've got retention ponds here where the water is kind of being brought into after when we're harvesting, and office on the left, and purge tanks, in, you know, if we need to use them there in that building on the right. So then, you know, again, this might just help you see how things are moving around, and if you can't change the pathways, that's fine, but at least maybe you have an idea of how things may be biosecurity issues to consider. So let's say you've got enough people that you have folks that are working just in the quarantine areas. Those are indicated by the path in red. Kind of use different colors here. Got a yellow path for the folks that are just working broodstock, path for folks that are working in the hatchery, and then a blue path kind of coming down and from the left to the right and up into the ponds through another gate there, and also kind of leaving through the back when they start bringing fish out, and then a path leading for we'll assume these are like live tilapia that are going to be hauled out through the back area there. And of course, we got people working in the office, so don't want to forget those guys. And again, I have things labeled there. All right, farm perimeter control. Now, this is something that may or may not be easily fixed for you. You know, if you're dealing with, for example, you know, bivalve culture, obviously that's going to be tricky. You're, you know, in coastal areas, or net pen culture is going to be a little more complicated. If you are in a heavily rural farm area, you know, that there may be challenges with that depending on the size of your property, et cetera. So, you know, I kind of gave a little bit of an extreme here. You got on the lower right. That's a really pretty secure perimeter there. That's the Great Wall of China. In case you didn't figure it out, we got some people posted there. You know, real tight control here. You know, again, this is a little bit more kind of being a little bit facetious, but you know, there can be different levels of control depending on your concern for disease and entry of other unwanteds. And then you may have just, you know, this little map. I mean, this little field fence, but you know, who knows? Maybe there are these large dinosaurs lurking around, and you need to have some way to kind of control them. So again, I'm being a little exaggerating a little bit, but there are different things, you know, that you may have animals getting on a property, and maybe there's ways that you can at least try to minimize their entry if you don't have a great perimeter. So you have to kind of keep those in mind. Do you have gates? You know, is it a complete fence or a partial? What are the controls at the entry and exits? And you know, with regard to vehicles, personnel, pests, predators, and of course the animals coming in, the production animals. So the aquatic health team, this would be another area that you would basically list and have contact info for. So hopefully, you know, regardless of the size of your facility, and maybe this person is actually you, but you should have someone who is the primary contact for health management issues. Then an accredited veterinarian if you're dealing with an accredited veterinarian that is familiar with aquatics is very helpful, or if you have a health specialist. And then if you need to work based on your shipment protocols and imports, exports, you know, an accredited vet, of course, is going to be very helpful. So keep those things in mind. A diagnostic lab that is going to work with aquatic animals and, you know, that has worked with the veterinarian before is ideal. All the personnel and contact info. If you're working with extension agents or other consultants, have their information available. So, you know, if there's an issue, people know where to go to look for them and how to contact them, and then the state or federal contacts as well. Facility health goals. I included this, and, you know, this is maybe beyond, maybe this is kind of like the next level of biosecurity plans, but I think it is helpful. And in some plans, it is included. It is helpful to have goals so that you can maybe look at it in a semi-annual or annual basis to see whether what you've done with your plan is actually helping you to reach those goals. And the goals should be determined by, you know, you, the owner, if you're the manager, or if you're the manager working with the owner and the health team as a whole. You obviously want to try to have goals that are measurable. And, you know, it can be something as straightforward as reducing, at least the goal is straightforward, you know, how to get there may be a little more complicated, but things like reducing weekly or monthly losses by a certain percentage, reducing the use of drugs by a certain number of dollars, increasing your harvest by a certain percentage, which, you know, potentially if you have a good plan, maybe there are low-level losses that are really cutting into your bottom line, and so that would be, you know, helping with our harvest. And then even things, again, if you've got a really good facility, maybe you need to start looking at trying to decrease grow out time, you know, based on trying to improve just other production practices that, you know, are somewhat affiliated with health and pathogens even. So, you know, keep those things in mind. Bottom line, you know, obviously is to try to make sure that you increase your economic goals. And having health goals will also help reinforce what records are required and that need to be kept in order to be able to track the stuff. Water source, you know, again, this is pretty basic and obvious. We've talked about this before. In some cases, you may not be able to control what your water source is, but at least be aware of potential issues so that you know if you have a problem, then, you know, you need to think about these. So what is your source? Is it a protected source? Typically, deep wells should be fairly protected with regard to specific pathogens. Municipal or city water sources are typically going to be disinfected with chlorine or chloramine, so you should have much of a less likelihood to get any type of pathogens as well. And or if you have a source that you are disinfecting. If you have an unprotected source without disinfection, then, typically these are going to be groundwater sources, fairly shallow, maybe even shallow wells, lake or river or ocean sources. And, again, these are not necessarily bad, but you just have to be aware that if there are organisms or potential for disease organisms that can affect your animals to be in these water bodies, they're going to be less biosecure than protected water sources. And if you can, you want to consider some sort of treatment. If you use a lot of water, that's going to be obviously really expensive and complicated. So, there's going to be weighing of risks here. If you have a major problem and you are using an unprotected source, you need to examine your source and probably look at cost-benefit analysis for maybe trying to incorporate treatments. It may be filtering out sediments that may help trap some of these organisms, and maybe use of UV sterilization or bleach or bleach and neutralization, and then or ozone. So different things to consider, but again, you're going to have to do this on a case-by-case basis. And then also, what type of water quality and chemistry testing is done on your water source. Things can change. We have in Florida, we've got aquifers, and we have fairly high water tables. But if in times of drought, or we've had a number of years when the water maybe hasn't been replenished as quickly, our water parameters will change. Now, again, with regard to disease organisms, that may not be quite the same as it is maybe with regard to specific parameters, but it is something you may want to consider, and potentially looking even at testing for pathogens if you are unsure, maybe for bacteria or other types of organisms. So what type of systems do you have on your property or in your production units? The type in management is good to kind of keep track of. They're all going to have their own specific issues. RAS system, or recirculating aquaculture systems are going to have specific types of management and potential for spread of disease and ways to try to reduce that. Flow-through systems, are going to also have specific issues. They may be better in some ways than recirculating aquaculture systems with regard to maybe less buildup of pathogens, but they're going to have other disadvantages, including the use of a lot of water, obviously. Earthen ponds are pretty natural, and we use them a lot in Florida, and obviously in the Delta, the catfish folks and others as well. But they're going to have their own types of issues. Net pen culture folks, salmonid, some of the other marines are going to have their own issues as well. And a lot of those, maybe you're going to have to just really look at the animals going in, or as well as maybe the net pen themselves. And if you're worried about parasites, how often those net pens have to be changed, or what type of siting you've done. Hopefully, with a lot of this, the siting of the where these are going to be located is a lot has gone into that. And benthic cultures, likewise, if there's disease issues in bivalves in specific areas, obviously, I'm assuming most of the folks working with bivalves know, what they can and can't do based on what lots are available. But that's still part of biosecurity and things that, even if you don't think you can do biosecurity, that's stuff that you may be doing already, and it would be part of the big plan. Indoor versus outdoor, again, the type of holding units. Farm map location, if you have a farm that maybe has multiple types of these systems, it would be nice to know where they are located. Some of the facilities here in Florida have multiple types of systems. They have recirculating systems, flow through, and earthen pond, for example. So, it can vary depending on your facility. And also, where is your wastewater going? Are there retention or detention ponds on property? Is there, what are the regulations with regard to your state and local areas as well as federal? So here on this fictitious farm here, tilapia, Tony tilapia, I have the RAS systems marked out, and the ponds are obviously presented as well, and the flow-through system where the purge systems are. So the quarantine and the quarantine areas, everything kind of spelled out here. All right, so now the other issue, especially of course with folks that are dealing with outdoor facilities, is knowing what types of other animals can cause issues and potentially introduce or spread disease. So having, even starting out by just listing what is on the property, and if you have any type of control of those animals. So pests, again, are going to arise in pond culture. There are going to be potential carriers of intermediate hosts for parasites or potentially bacteria or viruses. How are you controlling those? Predators, again, these are common, and in ponds as well as in net pen culture and in bivalve culture. So is there a way to control those? In some situations it's going to be really tricky. On farms on land, you may have to use nets or other types of controls. And then for some of these facilities, are there domestic animals? So do you have cows or goats? Do you have dogs running around? Not to say they're bad. I know folks that will use cows and goats to kind of help keep weeds and grass down, do a real nice job, but they also have the potential, and often do, walk into the ponds, move around, go from one pond to another. If you're dealing with animals that may have or be susceptible to specific diseases that may be reportable and actionable, as we talked about, then that's going to be an issue if you have an outbreak in one pond and you can't show that these animals haven't been walking around, and you haven't been able to keep that pond isolated. So, again, not that you have to change anything, but you really need to be aware of these things and mark it down and list it, and consider changing it if you can. So what types of control do you have for all of these? I just listed a couple, but I'm sure there's a lot more. We used a lot of netting, of course, pesticides, legal pesticides, fences, noisemakers for birds. Some folks have tried using dogs to deter birds, and we talked about potential issues with that if the dogs are going in and out of the ponds, but different pluses and minuses. Food and feed, obviously really important, and it probably is apparent. Typically commercial pellets, crumbles, flakes, etc., are going to be less likely to bring infectious disease in, but not necessarily that they never can, but very, very, very less likely if they're maintained and stored properly and etc. But frozen foods and live foods are going to be more potentially of an issue with regard to introduction of disease organisms. Again, even depending on what type of food you use, some bacteria, as we discussed earlier in the first webinar, can survive freezing. Strep is a good example. I think there was a study that showed it. Streptococcus survived 6 months in frozen fish. So, again, there's things, and a lot of times it's broodstock that are being fed this, but there are different things that can survive, and viruses, definitely can survive as well. So keep those in mind, and not that you shouldn't use those, but if you are concerned, you may want to consider having some lots tested, or if you do have an outbreak, maybe consider testing those then. Are things stored properly? Do you have good quality assurance and control for whether they are being stored properly or not? And again, if you are concerned or if you have outbreaks, are you going to be able to test, or do you know how you're going to be able to test so that you have that information available for specific organisms? All right, the people part now, the very tricky and complicated part. Do you have training? Now, a lot of folks will kind of show people what to do and train them, and that that's good. But when we're talking about obviously biosecurity, are you having any specific discussion about biosecurity, and do the employees understand why they're doing things and how it can help the facility to improve? Things like that. Husbandry, of course, like I said, typically folks are being trained that, but the biosecurity part of that is really the part that is often overlooked, and even if it is mentioned, it's maybe not as, there may not be as much accountability, and there may not be as much oversight with those things in some facilities, not to say yours necessarily. Is there someone that can do some basic on-farm diagnostics? Things like external, for fish anyway, things like external checks for parasites. That's something that someone can be trained. Obviously, if you've got a veterinarian you're working with, and/or another aquatic health person that can help, to oversee that, that's helpful. But if if someone is really motivated and you've got a good person there, they can do some of this stuff and get some immediate information, and of course communicate that with the other folks on the health team, including vet, health specialists, etc. But that's always a helpful thing if you can do that. Do the people understand the big picture of biosecurity and health plans, and are there SOPs available? Again, for their reference as well as for yours. Is it written down? We talked about that. A lot of folks really don't have things written down, maybe to the degree that they should, because it is a lot of work. A lot of this stuff is going to be hard work at the beginning and requires someone that's motivated and has the, understands why it is helpful, and also can kind of be a little bit of a detail person. But you don't have to be that crazy of a detail person. You can even start with just real basic, one-pagers on different things. And that's actually a really good start. And then you can kind of improve on those as you go on. So how are the people with regard to training for cleaning and disinfection? Do they understand how to do things? We are going to talk a little bit about different, just in general, different pathogens, may require different types of disinfection. Now, are these things available for the people? This is kind of a thing you would maybe list, and also how is oversight for this? So what kind of compounds are used and what concentrations for different things like net dips, foot baths, again, if you're dealing with maybe net pen culture, wetsuit disinfection, hand washing stations. Are there shower in, showered out facilities? And again, for some of you folks, this doesn't make any sense, but for other people, this is a really critical part of their business. Vehicle and boat disinfection, are there specific instructions? Do you have that for specific holding unit types? So where you're going to do your best to clean and quote unquote disinfect, for example, ponds differently than you would an indoor tank. So what are those differences? How can you make sure that those are being done at least to the best of their, that they can? Quality assurance, quality control. Got some pictures there of hand washing station, foot bath, basic net dip. Are there ways to clean vehicles coming in if that's a concern, and boats, for example, and really good records. Are you keeping, or can you start trying to keep good records with regard to all of these different areas? We're talking about husbandry, SOPs, management, verification of things being done. So kind of your checks and balances systems, cleaning and disinfection, feeding, observation, water quality. Do you have like a checklist for people? Are they initialing it? Do you know how you can kind of backtrack to see who did or didn't do something that they were supposed to? For example, here, like this net dip disinfection schedule, I did it a couple days ago and kind of checked it there. So, and then on the animal health front, when we talk about quarantine and biocontainment, this is something that is really important for, some situations. In general, if you can do this, it's great. It's ideal, and especially with animals of unknown health status. And, if you got major concerns on your facility, it's really important. Even if you don't, it may be something that you're not even thinking of that, you should be worried about. And this is where communicating with your health team and the veterinarian in terms of emerging diseases is really important. So is your facility using dedicated tanks, ponds, or holding for incoming animals that need to be quarantined? Are there signs and restricted access if possible for that? Are you following what we call all-in, all-out stocking? So you're not kind of just adding fish every couple days or weeks and, not really adhering to a specific kind of time frame and period for observation for quarantine. And if you have animals in residence already, have you figured out a way to isolate or separate lots that become sick? We talked about this. It may be difficult. You got a system with 20, 30 different tanks. You get a tank that's starting to break down. Some of the facilities we work with will have a way to do maybe flow through for that tank, so the water is not getting mixed with everything in other tank if you got it on a recirc, or have a way to maybe set up its own individual recirc. There again, some of these things are going to cost more money. Some of them may be worth it, if you've got a disease that's really an issue. But it is just something to be aware of and to consider. I've got on the right there a picture of, we talked about quarantine, having separate quarantine buildings and or a quarantine pond if you need to, and redundancy as well, with on the picture here, having multiple life support systems and kind of separated, and hopefully some type of separation as well by different equipment and supplies used for those. Animal health kind of continued. Are people following the written SOPs, and are things being recorded with regard to observations, surveillance, response, and diagnostics? So, whether it's in the quarantine area or just in general, are people looking at and doing feeding observations, behavior, external appearance, mortality? Many of you who have been in the business for a while know for animals that you can observe feeding. Some animals you're probably not going to be doing sitting there watching them feed, like some of the bivalves, for example. But for fish, if you're feeding them, hopefully the person that's feeding isn't just throwing food into the pond or tank and not actually looking to see what they're doing, because that's really critical. And if you can catch issues early, that's important, and that needs to be recorded, and that should be an SOP. And then things like being able to look at their behavior and appearance as well, and if any morts are there. Surveillance, now everything looks, you've got a facility where everything's perfect, that's great, but it is probably a good idea to do some sort of targeted routine sampling periodically, you know, and that way you can even further reduce your chances of having a major outbreak. So, you know, work with your health team and figure out, well, can I maybe sample from these areas and maybe even rotate where I'm sampling. Some of the facilities we work with here will rotate, at least even looking for parasites on ponds. You know, they may rotate so that every pond is looked at least once a week. You know, and we've got some farms that have, you know, several hundred ponds. So that is something to consider. You know, what types of diagnostics can be done? What diseases are you worried about? All those things would be taken into consideration. You know, is there a good written response and what to do for specific organisms or disease outbreaks? And again, what types of diagnostics are you going to be doing? Along the same kind of lines are the following in written SOPs, and are they being recorded? So with regard to specific diseases, is there information on whether it needs to be reported, and also what that chain of reporting is? We talked about some of the reportable diseases previously that either are state or federally reportable, and some of those will require action and some won't. So, you know, is that knowledge there so that if something happens, you know, it's not going to be a frantic rush to figure out what what needs to be done. That stuff's, you know, written down and everybody knows what to expect. So big phone here, calling the state or you know, federal veterinarian there, knowing who to call about what, and you know what's going to happen once you call, how the disease is going to be managed, and again whether the disease is a reportable one or not. And then cleaning and disinfection, and this is pretty important. You know, a lot of folks, you know, we've talked to, and we did a survey for various producers for kind of another project, and we found that some people were using disinfection methods that really weren't going to work for the diseases they were worried about. You know, a lot of people think formalin is a good disinfection for bacteria, but really it's terrible. And so, I mean, you know, there's things that you really want to make sure, if you're not sure, you know, it's not a terrible thing, but you want to educate yourself. So, you know, I'd rather somebody comes to me and tells me things they're doing, and you know, and you know, they're completely wrong, and then I can at least help them correct things, than, you know, not to even come and talk to me or you know, their health team and other people that can help them. So it's better to try to educate yourself and rather than to kind of just follow along things that have been done forever if you're really not sure if it's working. And then in some cases, you really do want to know how your deads are going to be disposed of. Some places have fairly strict regulations, especially with regard to specific diseases. So, you know, that stuff hopefully is written down and in place for specific pathogens. Maybe not every single one that your animals may be susceptible to, but there may be specific diseases that you need to know this is how they're going to be handled. So you need to, again, be working with your team to know what needs to be done. And again, do you know your pathogens? We spent a little bit of time on this in the first webinar. Scared little green fish here. Lots of things that, you know, kind of want to be friends, but in the wrong way, if you know what I mean. So you got bacteria, viruses, parasites, and fungi here. They're not all created equal. Some viruses are worse than others, likewise with some bacteria. And then, you know, among the different groups, they're going to have different levels of concern for you. So which of these can your animals get? Are any of them regulated? We talked about how easily and quickly can they cause disease? Where can they hide? How do you test for them? How do you control them? How can you clean and disinfect? So in the ideal world, you would at least have maybe a couple of the major ones that you know of, that you've worked with your vet, your health people and consultants, and know our potential issues, and kind of answer all these questions, and, you know, on a nice sheet of paper. There's going to be a lot of different diseases animals can get that may be still important, and you would like to know a lot of this information. But if you can at least concentrate on maybe the ones you guys early on identify, that's really a great start. And then you kind of build your different kind of lists from that. So I think that would be really a great thing. It's, again, probably above and beyond what some folks would do for a biosecurity plan, but I think it's really helpful because it gets everyone thinking on the same page, and you, again, have things sort of written down. So there's no stress on like what needs to be done. It's kind of all there. And usually, many of you probably know when an outbreak is occurring in fish or other animals, shrimp, whatever you're raising, are dying in mass, large numbers. People are kind of running around and trying to figure out what to do. And so this is what you want to do all this before all that occurs. So as I mentioned, if you can have a list of specific facility-specific pathogens that you're worried about, and I named a couple here. You got bed bacteria, Vicky virus, Pat parasite, and Fred fungus. So maybe these are specific pathogens that this little fish here is worried about. If they're reportable, if they're actionable or not, depending on the type of disease. If they're not reportable, what can cause a lot of problems, if they're, and in some cases, these are going to be moderate to high morts, or there are some diseases that are really not treatable. I know people that are maybe have a disease outbreak, they're using all these different sorts of drugs. They haven't really worked with a disease diagnostic person or a vet or, a health specialist. And when, we see the animals, we tell them, yeah, this is, mycobacterium, there's really no treatment for it, or something like that, or it's a virus. And so it really is important because in the long run, you're going to reduce your worry and cost and labor in things if they're not treatable, and then there's issues with some diseases that may be zoonotic that you want to know ahead of time as well. That means that they can cause disease in animals as well as potentially transmitting that disease to people. I gave this list from the World Organization for Animal Health, the OIE, in the first webinar. Just kind of restating it here for you so you have it again, but the website oie.int is a really good one for the international reportable diseases. And you may or may not have diseases or organisms that you're raising that will be susceptible, but if you do, it's good to know. Likewise, again, the states, this is Wisconsin's, are going to have their own specific diseases. This is Wisconsin here, we talked about. Here's Florida. Lots of things you need to know based on where you're raising your animals. So if you can have a real nice pathogen-specific management plan, again, at least for maybe a couple of the pathogens that are really a big deal for you, that's great. The more you can have, the better, and the more you're going to be able to incorporate employee education with regard to some of these, and really kind of hammer that in. That's really great, I think. So hopefully you got a way to kind of keep these away from the little green guy. Ideally, the team kind of talks about it. Maybe you are the team, you and your vet, or you and your vet and health specialist, and is that all signed off so everything makes sense? Diagnostics, biocontainment, how to treat and manage the disease if it is treatable, and specific cleaning, C&D cleaning and disinfection to make sure that it's going to be appropriate for the type of disease organism that you're dealing with. And is there a prevention plan? And some of this stuff is going to overlap with what we talk about in quarantine. Some diseases, including some viruses, some bacteria, do have vaccination options, or you may be able to develop vaccines for specific bacteria that are routinely occurring, again and again on a specific facility, or your facility. You can work with folks to develop vaccines. So, again, a lot of options that can be considered. And then, of course, as we talked about, communication and really being able to explain what needs to be done, and so that and why, so that the in-farm staff and visitors know what's going on, especially, of course, the employees. Wanted to reiterate again the CAPS program, which was started by the National Aquaculture Association in conjunction with the USDA APHIS, and the fact that we're talking about biosecurity and trying to kind of give you guys a real rough template. I know some of you maybe looked at it and thought, wow, this is really messy, but it's got a lot of information there. That's fine. But again, if you can kind of start looking at it and start maybe filling in the blanks, this will really help when, CAPS, which is a volunteer program, more and more folks kind of get involved and really start looking at it. And just again, to reiterate, the CAPS program has 5 principles or components listed here. So aquatic animal health team is number 1. And again, if you're a small facility, maybe that's you and, working with the vet and however that's going to work, but, you can still have a team. doing the risk characterization and management we talked about, and that's going to be really site and animal and system specific. But that'll be part of the biosecurity plan. Surveillance, which is essentially trying to have a strategy and plan for looking at specific disease organisms. If you're dealing with animals that are known to have some pretty bad organisms or that are reportable, this is really important. And even, again, to keep you from having major outbreaks of some of the common organisms like, ick or some of these others that can cause a lot of problems but are really pretty common, or at least, people are aware of them and they're not reportable. Investigation and reporting, how are you going to investigate health issues and report them, and to whom? So all the stuff that we talked about, ideally having, you having that in your protocols. And then the response as well. How is this issue going to be addressed? How are you going to recover and return to business as usual? So again, I'm kind of just reiterating how this will kind of help you start getting into the groove for CAPS if you do decide to volunteer and become part of the program. CAPS will have a site-specific health plan, and as I mentioned previously in the first webinar, a lot of different components to that, but that will include a biosecurity plan, which we kind of talked about. And the plan we talked about really does incorporate some information that would be in kind of the general health plan, as well as the surveillance plan. But, it's all kind of the same, bottom line. You're trying to keep your stocks healthy and try to keep disease organisms out and away from your animals. So in summary, biosecurity is an important component of good farm management. You want to really start with a protected water source and healthy animals coming onto your facility. You want to develop a health team, do essentially a risk analysis type, looking at critical control points and how those are going to be managed and worked, and then have a written health plan, surveillance plan, and a biosecurity plan. And really having good employee buy-in is going to be very, very important. You want to know your pathogens and how to manage them. Like I said, in the ideal world, I would love if all of you had maybe a list of 10, 15 different pathogens that are of concern to you and how you're going to manage each of those. And if they're reportable, who you need to contact, how they're going to be treated, diagnosed, how you clean and disinfect after them, all those sorts of things. But, if you can start with one or two, that kind of will give you an idea and get you in the groove. And it's really important, again, because some of the pathogens are going to be much more of an issue than others. And some are going to be much more of a regulatory issue than others with regard to, reportability and action as well. Quarantine and isolation of sick animals, again, to reiterate, it's really going to help save lives. So you're in quarantine, new animals can give old animals diseases. When I say old, I mean animals that have been on your facility. And likewise, those animals that have been on your facility maybe have recovered from a disease and be carriers and potentially give those to your new animals. So the quarantine helps all the animals kind of get up to speed. Ideally, if you can keep them separate, that's great. But if they need to be put together, at least the new animals will have a chance to get their defenses up. Typically, after shipping and handling, they're going to be more susceptible to diseases than if they're given a little bit of time to acclimate. And finally, you really want to stay current. I mentioned all the different ways what that means with regard to current, and really have good communication. Many of you probably know communication is almost the most, well, I say everything's important, but communication with employees and making sure that it's mutually respectful and everybody understand what's going on, type of communication is really important for a good outcome. So again, this is just all the stuff we covered already. I'm not going to maybe mention all this. We'll just kind of plop through them, but we went through and they're all on the template that I provided, which hopefully is of use. And I do want to get feedback. And, it's not, as I mentioned, organized maybe in the most clean way, but hopefully it has a lot of information that you can start putting together for your facility and see what maybe needs to be worked on or what can be improved upon. Again, remember that the plan, the health biosecurity plan, all the plans that you're developing are living documents, and you should be looking at them probably at least once a year, if not twice a year, but once a year at least, and seeing what needs to be changed and hopefully improved upon. So that was a lot. Hopefully that helped you guys just, again, to get into the groove and consider what you need to write down and what things need to be considered and thought about before you start putting your plan together. I do want to thank, again, Dr. Kathleen Hartman, Dr. Catherine Starzl, and Dr. Marion Helvel for all their great inputs and insights as I was putting this together, and a list of the references, as I mentioned earlier, that also include some of the biosecurity template related information that you have. I'd like to thank USAS, NCRAC, NA, and USDA for funding and helping to put together this series. And again, thank you all for attending.